Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is a great event that we try to do at least every year, if not every semester, between our program, the Master's of Science in Real Estate Development program here at GSAPP, at the Center for Urban Real Estate, as well as with the Columbia Business School and the Paul Milstein Center, run by my colleague Lynn Segalin, who's the Earl Kazis and Benjamin Shore Professor of Real Estate Development at Columbia Business School. So it's always wonderful to get our students together and to talk about interesting topics that are happening in the fields of development, real estate, and in architecture. Tonight, I think we have a very special treat in that it's, I think, a fairly common phrase that many of you have heard, that in order to build a great piece of architecture, you need both a great architect and a great client. And yet, it's astonishing to me how often we hear from great architects speaking about buildings, or we hear from great clients talking about developers, but so rarely do we actually hear from both of them together. And to really talk not just about the building as a beautiful finished product, but to talk about what it took to get there, what it took to get the site, what it took to actually create the particular collaboration of one client and one architect, what it took to actually conceptualize the building, work with city government, and then what it took to then either sell or rent the building and bring it to market, and how that building was received. And so tonight, I think we have an extraordinary opportunity to look into that whole process, not simply a building and not simply a development, but the entire process of how something quite extraordinary comes together, something called HL23 down on the High Line. I'm going to do some brief introductions, and then what's going to happen is we're going to have a joint presentation, and then we're going to moderate a discussion. Lynn Galen and I will do that. Neil Denari was born in Fort Worth, Texas, and studied at the University of Houston, where he received his B.Arch, and Harvard University, where he received his M.Arch. At age 29, he was the youngest member of 40 architects under age 40. Also in 1986, the Cooper Hewitt Museum purchased a drawing by Mr. Denari, the first of 7 major museums to have his work in their collection. The others include the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA San Francisco, the Denver Art Museum, Heinz Carnegie Collection, the Frac Center in Orleans, France, and the Museum of Modern Art in Sydney, Australia. His first project, built in Japan in 1996, the Interrupted Projections exhibition space, has now been followed by a series of bank projects for the Mitsubishi Trust Financial Group and other experienced economy projects. Since 1986, Denari has had a distinguished career as a teacher. He is a tenured professor in architecture and urban design department at UCLA. He has also taught at Columbia, the Bartlett, UC Berkeley, Princeton, and at the Harvard GSD. He is the author of 2 best-selling books, Interrupted Projections and Gyroscopic Horizons. Denari has won numerous awards, including the Richard Recchia Award and the Samuel F.B. Morse Medal for Architecture from the National Academy of Design in New York. In 2008, Denari received an Academy Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2009 and received a fellowship from the United States Artists Organization. In the year 2011, he received the Los Angeles AIA Gold Medal. He is a registered architect in New York and California and a member of the AIA, and has given more than 200 lectures around the world. Alf Neyman, the developer of the project tonight, has been developing properties in New York City for the past 15 years. In 1997, he embarked as a small partner on his first large project, 66 Leonard Street, or the Textile Building as it was called. The conversion of this 160,000 square foot loft building, designed in 1901 by Henry Hardenberg of the Dakota and the Plaza Hotel, was a fitting first project for Alf, having a strong background in historic preservation of older structures. Alf spent the years to follow investing in properties in Tribeca, the Meatpacking District, and other emerging neighborhoods until he found himself with his dream project, the rezoning of West Chelsea, you're welcome, and the ability to build a number of projects around the High Line and the Gallery District. His two most recent completed projects include 111th Avenue, designed by Jean Nouvel and Beyer Blinder Bell, and HL23, designed by Neil Denari. He also has two projects in the works, an office building adjacent to the High Line with the Albanese organization as the lead developer, and a development partner in a ground-up residential site near the West Side Highway, yet to be announced, but in development, and maybe he'll tell us something about that tonight. I'm very pleased to have Neil and Alf join us tonight. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for coming. I asked Neil how many lectures he's made in his career, and they're more numerous than I would expect. But he's spent the last 2 years talking about the project. This is probably the first time I've ever really talked about it. And one of the reasons that I've really never felt comfortable about talking about the project, it wasn't until really the end of this year that we sold out most of the project. So I felt uncomfortable about speaking about a project where we still had units to sell. Now we've got maybe 2 units left to sell at HL23, and pretty much in just some final punch list items that we're doing for each party. And also to speak for a few minutes today is Mark Rosenbaum, who started out very interestingly with Neil, kind of discovering the site, and he worked on the architecture side, and then after about a year, I pulled him over to the developer side to advise me as a consigliere and as a critic at large, to kind of give me some of the heads up of what it would be like to work on, you know, a project of this scale. It was the first project that I actually worked running the construction team. 111th Avenue, I sat in 5 years of design meetings, but I never had to go through the day-to-day battles of all of the construction nightmares that one does encounter. And it really is interesting. It's really a different world running the construction and on this project versus kind of running the marketing and the design on 111th Avenue. This is the site, as you can see. It's zoned for 85,000 square feet, and but it was impacted by the High Line structure. In fact, you can barely see the site as you're looking. This is the 2004-2005 photo, and the only way it's really recognizable is you can see a little bit of construction shedding on the street there under the High Line. So first time I came and looked at this site, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be a great retail site. So we negotiated to buy this site from Benny, who is the local beverage warehouse man. And it was an exciting site to buy because it was 85,000 square feet buildable on the site. So I bought it strictly for the purposes of adding air rights to 111th Avenue. Never thinking at all about, you know, any potential really to build as a construction project. I sent Mark and over to the site, and that's when things started to change. Really interestingly, at this time, city planning was still kind of open to the idea of the High Line being of sites being built next to the High Line, and this site was actually in litigation. So when we bought it, we kind of made a deal with the owner of the site to release the litigation, and that provided for the High Line to be released. It was called certificate, excuse me, of interim, I think situ was it? Certificate of interim trail?
Yes, interim
trail use. And once we bought that site, we released the litigation. The High Line went on, excuse me, and we were able to. We closed on the site. Let's see. Let's go to the next. Okay. Yeah. So that's the site from you know, an overview, I guess, a Google map. There you see Highline HL23 right there in bold letters. The Highline intersects the site. So the site is actually 12,500 square feet, yet you can only build on 4,000 square feet of it. So it was really a dilemma, how we could create a building on this site. And so a special authorization was provided in the zoning by city planning. And that authorization provided for sites that were severely impacted to be able to request some kind of a special authorization if a design of impact was created. So, hence, Neil Denari to the rescue to come up with some ideas on this. We actually gave it to 2 architects. The first architect came up with a 12-story, 25-foot wide building, and Neil came up with this wild structure that cantilevered over the High Line, was split, was really unique and fascinating. And so there was really no decision as to what direction to go in. And the whole direction to Neil was start with a building that's small at the base, enlarge it as we get up, let's take advantage of the high floors, let's get the largest part of the square footage on the top. Because as we all know, the sales market, the penthouses and the high floors sell for a lot more than the low floors. So let's see, let me just check and see if this is the best slide. Okay. So here we are. This is the beverage warehouse. This is the site where HL23 was conceived. This is it. Doesn't look like much of a site when you stand right up to the front of it. In fact, when I gave it to Neil, I said, I'm really sorry, I apologize, but I'm giving you this site, and I want you to take a look and see if there's anything you can do with it. And about 3 hours later, I get a call from Mark and Neil telling me that this was the most amazing site. I thought they were really kidding me. I said, I'm really apologize. And they said, no, wait till you see the way this site is laid out. Wait till you see the views that we can get. We started this project designing it in 2005. And it took about 15 to 18 months to get through city planning. Neil had the entire design of the project within the first 7 or 8 weeks, including a rendering, which was really amazing. But then it took, and then we kind of designed a lot of the interiors of the project as well. But he had an idea for a structure that he wanted to use. And that design pretty much held its way throughout the project. But there were many layers of city planning. First, you worked with the staff person at city planning, and they kind of guided you as to where they thought you could push the envelope a little bit and where you had no leeway whatsoever. So of course in height, I wanted to build a building that was 220 feet high so we could get enough height to overlook all of the rest of the buildings. At the end of the day, the height restriction is 145 feet in the neighborhood, so we got an extra 14 feet high that we could build a penthouse that was set back kind of as you would a historic structure where if you want to build on the roof, you can do a setback to the roof. So we didn't get very far with the height, but we got a lot of other kind of variances and waivers, which Neil will talk about and will be able to explain a lot more eloquently than I ever can. So, but we were able to get this at a time when the High Line was still kind of evaluating its design and how it was going to incorporate buildings. They hadn't designed the High Line yet. It was still kind of a concept that was still in its gestation period. So today, if you look at this building and you look at the Standard, which fully cantilevers over the High Line, these are probably the only buildings, in my opinion, that will ever be permitted to kind of encroach over the High Line. At this point, the High Line has totally changed their thinking They have 3 million visitors a year. It's kind of, if it isn't broke, don't try to fix it. And it's been, you know, it's just so successful. It's an urban oasis, and there's no way that the, you know, High Line is letting other developers come and, you know, kind of encroach the High Line at this point. And also because it's a park with millions of visitors every year, it's really hard to do anything where you would actually be building over the High Line at this point just because of safety features. But anyway, so I feel very lucky that we were able to do this building, and it's been a great honor to work with Mark and Neil, and Dux is here in the audience. Dux was actually the project architect, and then he just up and went on us after about you know, the first year and a half, but he went to do a special project at MIT, and you really get very close working with the people in your group. They teach you a lot about, you know, it's been a great learning experience. It's just a funny story about Benny. You know, when we really started, Benny's dream in this was to sell his warehouse, and so I said to Benny, listen, this is a great neighborhood establishment. You absolutely can't close it. The community will tar and feather me because they buy cheap beer and cheap soda here. So I said, but call me the minute that you want to sell it. So what happens, one day Benny calls me, says you have 48 hours to sign the contract and you have to pay me $300,000 more. So I rushed over to my lawyers. We had the contract. Within 2 days it was signed, and that was the protracted negotiations. 2 days between yes and signing the contract and putting down the money that I did. Lucky for Benny, he was thrilled. I mean, here it was. He just walked away with a princely sum of money, and I thought I had gotten a great deal because we were buying a lot of square footage for this piece of dirt, and I knew that the High Line had this right that I kind of alluded to a bit, that you could transfer air rights off-site, and the sites that you could transfer were the sites along 10th Avenue and along 11th Avenue, where the scale of the development was expected to be higher. Vishaan could probably give you a day's lecture about how that was all conceived. But what they did in the zoning is they preserved the charm of and the character of the neighborhood by keeping the mid-block zoning, which was all art galleries, and not letting greedy developers tear them down and ruin those structures. So the mid-block stayed for the most part to be warehouse structures, and it's really proven to be. And then the avenues where you could really take the higher scale of development were where these air rights could be transferred to. So 2008, we've got the foundation done, and it's October of 2008. I'm putting we're starting up the superstructure. So here I thought when I closed on this deal that I really had gotten the best of Benny, but in 2008 I'm just thinking about this guy sitting in Puerto Rico in a beach chair with this debt-free $12.5 million, and I've just encountered the worst financial markets ever, and as we all know that 400 to 500 stalled construction sites in Manhattan ensued. But we were very lucky. We had great partners, during this all, the banks got very nervous. We had our neighbor was having an attack about the crane that was going to be in front of his building, so he actually stalled us for several months. And in between, the financing markets totally dried up. So we had a loan, and one day we went into the bank finally after we settled with our neighbor and everything was great. And the bank said, well, we just thought about it. Instead of $31 million, we're going to give you $15 million. And out of that, $5 million was going to be an escrow. For as each sale occurs, we'll release $1 million. So at the end of the day, I had a very high net worth partner, and they and I were able to put the money in, and we closed with equity in this project. And so we just said, you know what, we're not going to take the risk of the bank's funding. We're not going to have to deal with that. So we closed with full escrow, which I think was really kind of gave us a lot more leeway. And we then upgraded certain parts of the project in the interiors. I figured, you know what, if there's going to be only half of the units that sell instead of 100% of the units that sell, why don't we just make this project so good that it just stands above the rest? So we actually upgraded the interiors. We did wide plank floors on the upper floors of the penthouses. We did slab bathrooms. I flew to Italy. We bought everything, and we really sourced materials really carefully. And I would say that our hard costs in this project were really were not bad for a project of this magnitude, because we bought the best of materials. Neil will tell you how we sourced this in something in Argentina. We sourced the stainless steel panel wall in Argentina, and we sourced the aluminum panels outside of London, and the curtain wall was made in China, and this very special glass movable wall was sourced in Italy. But I really think that the legacy of this building is going to be that 20 years from now, it's not going to look any different. I mean, everything was planned for really a building that was going to kind of maintain itself long term. We just, we worried about things like the stainless steel panel wall. So, somebody from Neil's team sat there for literally almost a year and a half in the factory and watched every panel come out, and they made sure it was dry fit. And so that we had, I think, 5/8 of an inch tolerance. Mark was the total kind of driver on the tolerance issues and just getting all of the little things that needed to be done, done right. So on the aluminum panel, we consulted a metallurgist to make sure that it wouldn't rust because of the salt in the air. On the erection of the steel, which Neil's going to show you all the pictures and go through things, we hired an erection architect. We had an engineer, and all of a sudden, sorry, an erection engineer. We had an engineer, all of a sudden one day, the engineer goes, I think the building might tilt two inches one way or another. So we ended up going through this incredible exercise to re-engineer the structure, and Neil can explain a little bit more, but where every piece of steel was plumbed to within a 1/16 of an inch. And those are the kind of tolerances that we worked with. 5/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch. I mean, there was barely enough room to really move. And it was really the commitment of the team and the commitment of everybody that worked in this project to kind of see it through. And I think it's a testament to the type of design, to the type of awards that the project has won. And it's a very small project to put this kind of effort into. Maybe I'll just should I talk about the cost now for a second? And then I can let Neil kind of say everything. Okay. Yeah. So our costs were literally about $850 a square foot to $900 a square foot to build this, which is, in related terms, probably double, that's hard costs. Yeah. So it was a very expensive project to build. But that's because it was a very small, fussy project that required, just a real, an erection process where nothing could be done in perfect sequence. Anyway, Mark, why don't you talk about the site for a little bit? And yeah.
Where do you pushes the slides more?
You push that.
Okay, thanks. I must have been in this auditorium 100 or 150 times, both as a student, then later as a graduate, and before then I worked in Avery Library, but I've never been on this side, which is kind of nice, and they didn't have this nice podium, which I really like. So thank you for having me up here. I originally came, just as by way of very brief introduction, I had got involved in part because Neil, who was teaching at Columbia when I went here, I was a student of his back then, and we had remained in touch as Neil is devoted to so many of his former students, and they become friends and colleagues. And we had, he had called me up to work on another small project just down the street from this, and we got involved, and we met the guy who was supposed to build it. There was a owner, but there was also a guy who was going to build it, and it was this tall, lanky guy, Alf Naiman, who, you know, you size people up pretty fast when you're an architect. You have to, as do developers. And I looked at Alf and I thought, you know, very ambitious, but very nice personality, smart, you know. And already he was like trying to worry about how you'd build galleries under the High Line, which is something, as far as I know, I might be wrong, they haven't successfully done yet. And so Alf was already on that like 6 or 7 years ago. This is, anyway, to talk about the site, this is the end of the spur, which is the, do they give you a pointer here? Ooh, does this do anything? Neil, you've done a few lectures. Thank you, boy. All right, so this, the HL23 sits, or would sit, and we knew would sit between here, somewhere off the High Line. There was a setback rule which was amended thanks to Neil's design and Alf's basically lobbying for it. You were supposed to be back a certain number of feet. I think it was 15 by law, which basically by right. And that would have put us basically like over here somewhere. And we did manage, as you know, and as those of you who've seen the building know that the building starts considerably further in from there and then goes to 0 and then goes to +5, but that's for Neil to explain. Anyway, we had a spur over here, and we knew the building would be bifurcated by the spur. It would extend from here to here, and how far over it would go would depend on what we could get from zoning. What Alf didn't mention, and you can see it right here, is he showed you the site, which looks very compressed from 10th Avenue. That wasn't the site. That was the site minus the next building over. Our building actually started over here. So there was another building coming 20 feet even closer to the High Line, and we were left with this 40-foot or so sliver of what was left, half of which was bifurcated by the High Line with a setback of something, as I said, in the neighborhood of 15 feet by right. So the gamble to be able to build this building to any sort of ambition, with any sort of shape, with any sort of growth as it went up, and to be able to finance a nice piece of architecture was all speculative at the time. And it says a lot for a certain kind of developer who will roll the dice very early in order to get, in order to say, I see the vision, and I'm willing to support the vision, and I'll go as far as you guys can go, or we'll, you know, it was like, we'll go as far as you go. And he's like, I'll go as far as you go. It's like, well, let's all go. And we just kept going. And it really turned into, from a conceptual process, into a fully realized building, which doesn't often happen with such speculative matter. So anyway, the High Line, this is the spur. The more normal part of the High Line has, I don't know, Neil, what's the, do you know what the width is on the north? Alf, do you know what the normal width of the High Line is?
About 30 feet.
About 30 feet. So this basically almost doubled that, or this allowed us to have another 20 or so feet off of this. And this is where the trains used to park. They'd be coming down this way. And when I saw this site for the first time, I haven't seen the slides yet, so I just want to, I don't know if I'm over-talking the slides yet. This is basically looking down the High Line. Looking north. So up the High Line with our site over to one side. When I saw this, I said to Alf that, I said, this is the most amazing site I've ever seen. It's literally, some people get to live on the park. This building's going to be in the park because the spur came out into the building. And because of that, you had what architects like to call a forced perspective, meaning you had a park that was getting wider as it hit the building. So that from looking inside the units out, you'd be seeing this triangulated park moving away from you, and almost like an optical illusion. So I was just beside myself, and I was fortunate enough to see the I think the first person on the site and to climb around. I called Neil up, I called Alf up, and I just, started basically jumping up and down saying, this is astonishing, and, the power of enthusiasm sometimes does get you somewhere. I really believe in that. And this is also another one looking, basically this is, oops, oh, did that go somewhere? Okay. This is the building. Alf, we were over.
You're looking south.
Yeah. This is the spur.
Right.
This is where the building sits. As I said, I didn't have a chance to review these slides. This is the rental, I believe it's a rental across the street. There's now a new building over here. This building, which is an unfortunate piece of architecture, I hope the architect's not sitting in the, sold out in 48 hours, which shows you something of the speculative nature of the market when we started conceiving this project. This sold out in 48 hours, okay? We've worked on our project from beginning to end for 6 years, which isn't to say it was on the market for 6 years, but it was on the market for well more than a year, well more than 2 years. The building slid right here, but again, another building was built here first by the original architect was Lindy Roy, but she was subsequently removed from the project for being too competent, I believe. They went through 4 contractors and a number of architects. So our building, Neil's building, Alf's building sat right there. And it's obvious that the best way I can describe it is what I said to Neil when I called him up. I said, those sites you get in graduate school where you get to build on the tip of Roosevelt Island, or you get to build like on top of the Lincoln Tunnel, and after the review, everybody says, well, that was a great project, Bill, but of course no one would ever give you a site like that to build. This is that kind of site. It's like a graduate school site. It's like the kind of sites where Broadway intersects the grid. You get these very unusual conditions, sliver conditions, triangulated conditions. This is not a triangulated condition. The spur is. But you get these leftover residual pieces that allow you to sort of make a statement about what the rest of the grid is like. I don't know if there are any more slides here. So is this the beer and beverage?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm supposed to be the site expert here. Okay, so beer and beverage here again. Very simply, our building was extended about 20 feet in for that the Lindy Roy structure, and then the rest of the site was ours. And what you can't see is basically our building. There's some distortion visually, but our building extended as far this way as it extended this way. But of course, it started with a setback, which I think started for us at under 10 feet. But anyway, Neil will talk more about that. And here you see this forced perspective, so that we really had a building with a kind of a front lawn in front of us. And what the Highline subsequently built there was a lawn. So we were on a few buildings that have a lawn and some bleachers too. Is that you, Dukes? Yeah. This is Dukes. And again, it's the same picture again and again. I don't know how much I could say about it, but what would happen is there are 2 tracks here originally. And if a train had to pass, the car or engine was sidelined on this side. And when we built the building, there was a federal trails permit that basically said that the building could not go back towards the High Line, meaning it sets back and then comes in. Could not do that until it was high enough to accommodate a train parking right here. And we said, what train? And I said, well, the use permit is a kind of provisional permit. We have to be allowed someday to rebuild it as a rail yard, as part of the permit's architecture, that is, as part of the agreement to the permit. So they actually, that's just part of the, what I call, I guess, the bureaucratic writing of the procedure is what this park is actually considered. I'm sure Diller Scafidio is not planning to see it revert to a bunch of trains running turkeys up and down, but that was some of the original thinking, or the original mandate, I should say. And there it is. Is there any more slides now? That's it. Okay. Well, I'd like to turn this over to Neil Denari, friend, colleague, teacher, and Demiurge for this whole project, whose firm was responsible for largely for the design and execution of this building. And here we are 6 years later. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation to come. It's really great. Assuming everybody's been on the High Line, I think we can kind of dispense with a lot of rhetoric. Lecturing on the building in the city that it's in is really fantastic to take advantage of the local knowledge. There were 3 conditions that were curious about this project. You know the site now, especially with the images, what it was before. The first condition was we were asked to do a project, condominium project, but it was vague in terms of how big it would be. We knew that it had to get bigger, but it was vague, and it was mostly vague in terms of what was the technique which we were going to get there with. Developer project is pretty finite, typically if it's an as-of-right building. You know how many square meters you're going to build, you know how many units you're going to get. So while the project was very, very specific in terms of its ambition and kind of outlining it culturally, it was vague in terms of how big it would be. The second thing was we were designing a monument, but we didn't know it. So it's a kind of reverse engineered monument, and the reason why it's a monument is the third condition, which is we have a captive audience. And we knew from the site, and we knew from Liz and Rick and Jim's design that it would be an amazing place, and we knew that there'd be millions of people every year. And what other building, except for something like the Pan Am building, which has a captive audience but in cabs or passing across the street, that you would have people essentially acting like human zoom lenses. You're just walking straight, moving, seeing this building closer and closer and closer, then it starts to twist. And that's really, really important in terms of how we thought about the project and designed the project. I think in that sense, the project, from the inside and the outside, they deeply relate to one another. But in the initial stages of doing the project, and Alf said that the project was kind of conceived fairly quickly, vague was going to get become more precise from the outside than the inside, because the program of the condominiums were, I won't say straightforward, but I will say that Alf had said, you're going to put the public space on the south, makes sense, a private space on the north, the sort of interior world of the third bedroom, kitchen, and so forth will find itself somewhere in the middle of the building, and that will have a curtain wall kind of as a preference on the north and south side, and in relation to the High Line, a surface that's going to be more opaque and perforated. So we had that as a kind of, let's say, zoning envelope, but how are we going to deal with the geometry was one thing. And so in designing this kind of erstwhile monument, and I don't say that as a self-aggrandizing thing, I just mean that the site itself demanded something unusual. Alf told you the story of sort of which fork in the road he took, the more risky one. And the more risky one, I think, was based on the kind of cultural ambition to mark the site of 23rd Street and 10th with something interesting. So at that moment, the captive audience was operating, and the project of standing out and fitting in at the same time. So what we had to work off of was this sort of ambition for a miracle, which was how to make a building sort of recalcitrant and kind of restive and resistive. And at the same time, a building that had to literally sort of find its place and squeeze into a site and look comfortable at the same time. So that's really what our kind of conversation was in the office, as you see these images of, you know, the High Line. You know, you won't see a photograph too often in New York with that type of relationship of a colorful fall moment right in front of the front facade of the building. Now, the High Line being this world of the captive audience, and I say that, you know, with great pleasure, just in the sense that the perception of the building from both all the way around 30th Street, just past Caledonia on the south, and as Mark said, you know, the building is sort of slippery. It sort of moves in and out of the kind of the optical line of the High Line. But very, very few conditions in the city like that. So we kind of took up that demand. And some things I'll point out, of course, were that the vague world of this surface right here, because we were pushing into the 15-foot setback very dramatically from the High Line. We knew that that elaboration of the facade and the profile of the building, as well as the way in which the structure was going to work, made the building a project that on the one hand was about 2D and about the nature of the profile, and also, just because of its local complications, very, very much about the 3 dimensions. So some quick diagrams. In red, this is the maximum building envelope. As Alf said, it's 145 feet, 102 at the main street wall, and you can already see the kind of impacting that's going on. This is the main issue. The High Line frontage in the special West Chelsea zoning asks for a 15-foot easement from either side of the High Line here. So everything that you see in yellow, nearly 40% of the square feet of the project is operating within this area. So it was vague in terms of how are we going to work beyond 25 feet? How are we going to make a project which ultimately wouldn't be arbitrated by city planning in terms of, well, how many square feet is it? How many square feet over is it? It's about the optical nature of the building, how it obviously deals with issues of light and air. Could we argue that it wasn't going to damage that kind of environment? So you see the diagram on the left, that's what we were given, and our commission, in a way, was with question marks. We have an ambition, but how high, how wide, how would we do it? Here are 3 particular waivers that were granted. We wanted to slope the face of the building rather than step it back, and we wanted to slope it back here, of course, because the spur goes in to the site 5 feet. We couldn't actually literally build the street wall flush up to 102 feet as zoning allowed, so we're going to have a kind of inverse slope in the massing, and that was a waiver actually. And the slope here is also a waiver because, as you know, the wedding cake profile of buildings in Manhattan are based on light and air. And this ask here in relation to this was purely at the level of a kind of formal project. And if you see the building, there's no moment except on the setback of the penthouse where there's any horizontal or vertical surface that, let's say, arbitrates the form. It's a prism. It's basically like a sculpted prism. And that was very, very important for us. And we found ways locally to try to make this geometry work, and so we did it here. And we went so far as to ask for 5 feet at the top, a kind of a minor world. We think this is the only building with public incursion of private space, besides cornices and things like that. Bernard's building, I think, is over private space. And we did this also because there's well, I would say a mandate on the one hand to get more square meters in the top of the building, but we also wanted one last small little slope to help the building actually become dramatic relative to the position of the High Line. These are early images, I would say about 3 or 4 months into the project. You can see that we're really at the scheme and issues of proportions where we were going to create alignments, slopes, etc. And even very, very early on with this ceramic frit in the glass, which I'll talk about. Here are the elevations as the building is built. You see the south elevation is a bit wider than the north half of the building. We created a split in this. Generates not only small windows in a few of the apartments in the middle, but it breaks down the scale of the stainless steel system, kind of arguing poetically at one level that this is a little bit of a kind of a vertical, a natural vertical condition, which is an extension of the horizontality of the High Line. The plans, on the one hand, were sort of auto-generative to a certain extent. When you get a building this small, we always understood that the core was going to be on the party wall side, and this was going to be a major element in the structure in this kind of vertical core. Private main rooms on the north for the private world, public world down here with kitchens. This is the 7th floor. The ground floor is a very, very straightforward lobby, again connected to the core, and the ground floor also has a lease space that fills out the site. Here's a curious image from the city planning world, but this was the community board, and this was their first vote. And I was not familiar. You know, one kind of parenthetical note is, you know, I'm trained as an architect, and learning from Alf about the development world in this project has been very interesting, and also what the public thinks about design and architecture. Even a liberal city like New York, you would come up against a certain amount of resistance. I recall that the vote of the 9 board members was 4 positive, 5 negative, and I was on the phone because I didn't attend the meeting, and I freaked out and said it's not going to happen. And they told me no one's ever gotten 4 votes before, so it was fantastic. It's usually 0 to 9, so we were on the right track. Now, meanwhile, and Alf kind of laid this out, the project as a commission, there were dice rolling at a certain level. You know, it took 18 months to get through city planning, but we weren't just doing due diligence at that time. We were actually developing the project. And Amanda Burden and her team were incredibly supportive. But meanwhile, the project was being developed. I show you this image. This is in Mocha, Los Angeles. In November 2006, there was an exhibition called Skin and Bones on the nature of fashion and design and architecture. So already in a year and a half into the project, the building became alive. And it became alive in, you know, a kind of museum setting. Its issues of ambition of structure and design and so forth. And it really began the media life of the project, which has almost been as fascinating as the project itself. Now, meanwhile, as I said, while it's going out into the kind of public world, we're developing the project, very, very kind of intense level of integration and detail. And this is the BIM model. Structural was a huge part of the project we worked on with Stephen D. Simone. We wanted, and from the very beginning, we wanted the diagonals, these are 8-inch steel pipes, we wanted them to run multiple floors to essentially make the project into 4 tall bays, rather than sort of chevroning, you know, a truss at every floor to make a rigid structure that way. So essentially, the structure was based not only on how we understood the cantilever and the rotating forces, and this is even before we talked to the structural engineer, but it's really about making the building look taller. So this is one other way in which we kind of talk about the building and its optical agendas, because remember, we've got a captive audience. What are they looking at? It was up to us to make a project that was going to be captivating for people on the High Line. We're 1 block away from the river. This is the world of New York. And launching a building out of the ground, of course, as you know, is the most difficult part of it. Once we finally get the bathtub put together, all the steel starts going up. The steel was fabricated in Montreal and driven down in prefabricated components that you see a shear wall here. This is at the elevator core. And the frame, I think, went up remarkably well. I don't think we had a single piece that was missized or any connection that was a problem. So here's a few views. This is actually a strange one. We're looking up at the corner of the High Line straight up. This is the underslung part of the structure. And you can see how the diagonal runs diagonally across. For all the structural nerds, of course, you know that intersecting a beam in mid-span with a diagonal member isn't naturally so good. But it's easy enough, and the engineers designed this kind of reinforcement, all of which is concealed. So that allows us this optical effect of sending the structure. And the other thing about it is it makes every apartment like a snowflake, sort of unique and different, although they're similar within the building itself, and some shots from the construction. We worked with Front Inc., a well-known group that everybody knows by now, the consultants for facades, and this was the first mock-up, and we all flew to China. We took our long plane ride. It was the first of many trips to go look at the factory, to essentially go deal with the process of global outsourcing. There were only two or three companies in Germany at the time in 2006 or 7 when we were beginning the contracting on the project, Gartner, Sealy, Enclose, and it was too small or it was too expensive for us. It didn't work out, so our consultants who were already looking for factories in China sourced the factory called Sanshin Glass in Guangdong province. We went to look at the quality of the materials. Now we jump forward to total production of the curtain wall. Each one of these is a steel frame welded by hand. So on the one hand, it was also a moment where we realized everything's digital. Everything's, you know, it's like the way in which buildings should be made today. But at the end of the day, this building is a handmade building. In fact, a lot of the pieces of glass were so big they didn't have an autoclave to put them in, and the spacers in the IGUs had to be actually put in by hand. They were too big for their machines. The Chinese have since said we're just going to go to Germany and buy bigger autoclaves, and when you come back we can do this you know, in a machine. So we actually pushed them well beyond their limits, and the craft and the quality was amazing. And really, in the end, this is a Lamborghini factory from the 1960s. It's a factory, but it's also more like an artisanal world. You're making things that are the same and based on machine-made things, but putting them together and assembling things was really a kind of act of love for everyone. So the steel frame is up, and challenging site conditions, almost like a Japanese project. The crane is lifting parts and pieces over the back of the side across the adjacent lots. Some technical drawings just to show you. Here's the main superstructure, the 8-inch pipes. These are painted with intumescent paint. We wanted to keep the profile down. And these prefabricated glass panels are essentially hung and then welded onto the face of the building. We don't have any proper spandrel panels. We get a joint or a horizontal transom mullion that goes from floor to floor. And this big piece of steel right here is actually welded to the back of the steel mullions here. It's almost as big as the main structure of the building. It was a fantastic proposition. This is actually the first piece of glazing and envelope to go on the building. In a logical fashion, we started on the north side. And each piece had to sit on top of one another and essentially stack itself up. And the envelope went up very, very quickly. And some views of it. Now I want to point out the ceramic frit, and there's a lot of images that are going to kind of articulate that. If you look at the aluminum fascia, which did come from the UK, I'll talk about these panels in a moment. The profile and the thickness of this wall is, of course, articulated with that material. This halo or doppelganger of the structure and the floor plates. And I'll tell you in a minute why we decided to put that on the project and why it became very important. So here's the buildup of the digital information. You can see the 3D panels. This is an atlas for the mega panels for the east facade. And this is an early mock-up that actually me and my students built in Los Angeles. This is in the UCLA shop. And in Argentina, after many trials with other materials and other fabricators, we found Dante Martinez with his company in Buenos Aires, and they manufactured 11'6" long by 1'6" tall panels that are three-dimensionally stamped, with the pattern actually running across the end grain making this tessellated surface. We dry mounted everything, all the panels. We all made trips. We all brought down our white gloves and our calipers and measured everything, punch listed the bead blasted surface, etc. So this project, to a certain extent, was about the ambition to reject anything that wasn't ready to be delivered to the site. Even the top radial parts of the building were all put together. The company manufactured all the purlins and the backup system, which were going to be joined on Long Island with the rigid wall panels. This is a section through the curving parapet at the terrace of the penthouse, and you can see the kind of elegance of the system, the rain screen, the purlins, the backup system, and the glazing. So this is on Long Island. All the panels are coming from Argentina, and they're arriving at the port, and they go to Calverton on Long Island, about where Long Island splits at an old Grumman factory. They're fully assembled, except for the last panel on each mega panel, because we've got to be able to get the caulking gun to be able to get into the panels and essentially glue the building together. And the challenges in the process, you see all of the guts. It's such an elegant building and what goes into it and the finished product. So you can barely tell where the main pieces, these were all prefabricated panels that get loaded onto the site and onto the facade of the building. You can't even tell bigger joints from smaller joints, and Mark Rosenbaum was a real master at pushing the fabricators to make those small, make them very, very equal. At the bottom of the building, if you've walked by, you see this fantastic moment where the surface geometry, which starts consistent at the top and splits, and then there are different radii on either side of the split, that actually come back into a planar surface, but there's a dislocation because of the way in which the surface geometry works. For us at NMDA, we're really, really happy to essentially express geometry rather than the ambition to always line things up. I mean, this is an intentional misalignment, and it really kind of talks about the, let's say, the fabric nature of the facade. Here's at the top where it splits, and we get the infill of the glazing. The windows are Schuco windows, prefabricated and actually dropped in after on site. The desk in the lobby was carved not by a machine, not by a CNC router, but by a human in outside of Italy, and it took about 6 weeks to do this. One person, a specialist in making Venus de Milo statues, and Alf's kind of thought on using monolithic marble was, number one, about weight. The building has this kind of sense of weightlessness, but he thought to have a project that was about the earth and about weight. But at the same time, he urged us to make a project that, at least in terms of its form, was weightless. So we dramatically cantilevered this very heavy piece. You see the Meco shades, which of course are there for sun control and also privacy, and you can see where they're drawn. And I wanted this pattern on the glass because, of course, we knew that the shades are going to be down most of the time. Shades are going to be down most of the time, and you're not going to see the superstructure. And for me, it was very important. Think about the captive audience. Think about the project of the graphic. Think about the project as it rotates from frontal to diagonal. The identity of the building. I wanted the structure to constantly be there. So essentially, this is day and night, you know, a representation of the structure in 2D form. I've had a lot of arguments with my most morally modern friends who said, you can't really do that, you know. That's not real, it's not programmatic. I said, I invented the program of the visual and the optical based on the captive audience, and it really does have an incredible effect to the project, because when you move by it, you actually see the structure behind and the optical effects of that registration. Some of the interiors. This is the 9th floor. It's the last floor that's got the vertical facade before it starts sloping back. This is the 6th floor. So looking south, the building is obviously splitting apart. On the east, it's splitting apart, and every unit is rather different in the way in which the structure appears within each floor, the position of these windows, and of course the slope and the geometry of the glass. Here you can see the halo of the frit following the structure. And knowing that the blinds are going to be down most of the time, it really became an augmentation, I think, of structure and program. Beautiful shot of a kind of a convertible bedroom area into an extension of the living area. You can see how bright and luminous the units are. This is looking actually to the north in one of the units. The kitchens are designed and modified polyform kitchens from Italy. Thomas Johansson was the interior architect. He did a great job. This is one of the master bedroom units looking north on the High Line. So the idea of making the curtain wall floor to ceiling as thin a mullion structure as possible. These are steel wrapped in stainless steel, so that this just becomes a kind of pure exhilaration of New York view. These are views on the north side of the building, where the building is totally sort of vertical and flush. Details. Maybe the best space in the whole floor plan, this master bathroom, just incredible. The penthouse Alf mentioned, this is the 14th floor of the building, and this was one of the waivers to extend the height of the building. It's turned into basically almost like a Japanese pavilion with wraparound glass and a wraparound terrace. These are shots from a few months ago. We're still putting all the parts and pieces together. These are Capo Ferri doors from Brescia, Italy. Beautiful, beautiful system, all motorized, operate, open up the corner. You see this view to the south and to the north. I think in the end the building is, it's both a building that stands out and fits in. I think it's a building that's a kind of silent witness to the activities, as it were, the lounging of the High Line. And that's really, I think the symbiosis of it is really what we went for. And our ambitions as architects, I think, were completely taken care of through the kind of complexities and conditions of the site. I think that's it. Thanks.
So thank you very much. That was terrific. We're joined by Lindsay Galen, my colleague from the business school, runs the real estate program there. And I'm sure she has many questions. I know I have a number of questions. But can you just start by telling us, so how did this end in terms of sales and exit, as they say in the business?
Exit's actually been great. I mean, I know we said that we spent a little bit of money and you were oohing and ahhing over it. But we also,
out of envy.
but we also,
The one and only.
we also raised our prices before once we were about 90% complete, but we were still really selling the first few units. We raised our prices substantially, and we sold for over $2,000 a square foot. So for 23rd Street, it's a real achievement because it's not a beautiful tree-lined block.
Right.
It's an urban thoroughfare.
Right.
You know, it's an extraordinary building, and from a development point of view, it's really an extraordinary process. And I have a particular question. I have lots of questions, but I have a particular question from you. You said you started out with 2 architects. How did you select this one? Did you know each other ahead of time? I mean, because you had to have a vision, which was not initially to build a tower like this, but really to do something else. So I mean, one of the hardest things a developer has to do to build smartly and to build, especially with a unique site, is to select the best architect he or she can find. So I wonder how you didn't talk about that, did you?
Well, it's kind of interesting because I'd like to say that over the course of the last few years, or during that period, I had met a lot of interesting architects, many of which we met with but never engaged. This was just a fluke of nature. Neil was actually brought in by Casey Kaplan, who was a local gallerist, and he had this brilliant idea to build under the High Line, but he didn't have the budget to do it. So after kind of getting Neil involved, and Neil looked at it and the pricing exercise, Casey realized that what he really needed was, because under the High Line has no shell. So you've got to, as a gallery, you've got to build the shell, and then you've got to do all the infrastructure. His budget was about $350,000, so there really wasn't the money to do both. And, you know, Mark was hitting me up, kind of say, what else can we do? And, you know, Neil was very curious about the High Line. I had them looking into some studies of how we could, because the High Line was no one has ever wanted to build under the High Line until very recently, a retail structure. Because what happens is there's shadows, it's dark, it's a little bit impacted and confined. And so I had Neil and Mark looking into and Dux, looking at some ideas about how we could bring light in from above the High Line, maybe with a glass floor or some other things. And the High Line was actually, at this point, engaging us and talking about it, interested to see what ideas would be thrown out there. So it was really just a fluke. When as we were kind of going through, this site came about, and I was like, you know, Neil, you could come up with something really unique here, and it just really happened. So it was actually a referral. I wasn't reading Gyroscopic Horizons or anything like that. It was just happenstance.
Well, I think on the one hand, the process, you know, was meeting out through another client, and so that obviously starts a kind of stream of things. I think that if I were to say, I mean, our level of our speed with which we were, you know, making work and responsiveness and so forth would give somebody some, you know, confidence. I also think that, you know, it was sort of like, well, let's see, because our first part of the project was do a concept design. Alf didn't, you know, set out and say, well, I think you're just going to go all the way through it. You know, we obviously had to show something that was kind of captivating. So I think at that moment, Alf wasn't worried about whether we were Norman Foster or not, and that the project could happen. And we just had to kind of trial by fire and, you know, kind of prove ourselves. But really the initial schemes that we did, I think, were, let's say every architect wants to just be able to get to the point where you can get a chance to show a client, you know, what you can do, regardless of whether or not you've done something like it before. You know, we know what kind of world it is. So in that sense, Alf is a rare client who didn't essentially go to, you know, X corporate firm to do a project to be able to go, I know how much it's going to cost, I got my exit strategy, and we're done. I think because he also knew it was going to be an erstwhile monument too, and maybe one of those firms out there wasn't going to be able to do that.
Right. It strikes me as one of the many layers of risks that you both took, or your entire team took, as you took this on. I mean, in terms of your initial take on the site, the rezoning passed sort of mid of 2005, as I recall, and you bought the site before then, right? So, you know, there's clearly a risk there, right? And then the risk that you're talking about, Neil, in terms of bringing in someone who is maybe not a sort of off-the-shelf developer architect, but would do something extraordinary. And then you both took this incredible risk of getting this approval. You mentioned, Alf, that, and I think you're right, that city planning probably won't approve again any kind of cantilever or anything that extends over the bed of the High Line, which I find fascinating given that both buildings that do it have been sort of lauded as quite successful. And yet you took this risk that you were going to get that approval and the modifications that you walked us through. I mean, what would have happened had that set of modifications not been approved? How would you both have, did you have a plan B?
Well, we would have just sort of had to stop. Alf could have decided whether or not, you know, to go back to an as-of-right building, although it seemed fairly certain that just wasn't the course of events, and that wasn't.
Well, I've never really thought that 25-foot wide high-rise buildings have really been that successful in Manhattan, and it's really not. It's a lot of work to build a building. So you've either got to build something of size or of stature, meaning, you know, from an architectural point of view. So one of the reasons there's a gap in between the first project I did and the second project I did was I never wanted to build a little small kind of starter upper building, because once you get involved in this, it consumes your life. And you really can't, you have to set everything aside you're doing if you really want to make it successful, because there are just so many steps that are along the way to really, you know, making it work and really maximizing the design. So we would have just done a retail building and sold the Erection.
Oh, wow. Bet you didn't know that.
Was this, I see the total logic from a development point of view of taking a risk on somebody who isn't a brand name at that point, because you know you're going to get as much as that person can give you. Yeah. Can you talk about the relationship of this project to your firm, and was it the consuming project as it was for Al? I mean, you know, how did you think about taking on a project of this kind of, there's an unknown magnitude of it when you say you were unsure of how big and the technique to get there. I mean, as you know, as Vishant said, it was gutsy on your part too. So I'd like to know, and I think everybody would like to know, to what extent this consumed your office, and how much of your time, and how do you organize for something like this?
After I was a director at a school in LA, and I kind of put my office back together again in 2002, and actually we began building shortly after that. So the office grew, and we got obviously more and more certain about being able to translate aesthetics, you know, that were really becoming very proprietary and very specific into the material world. Now, we hadn't taken on a building this big, but I think just our team, and Dux was really with me the kind of core group. We just felt like a kind of native instinct to be able to work. I wouldn't call it hubris. I would just say we like architecture, we think structurally, et cetera, et cetera. Mark's background was also very much in a kind of disciplined world of Richard Meyer and so forth. So I think collectively we felt confident, and I think the other things that really started to make the project work, and Alf mentioned, was he was not at all parsimonious about getting, you know, consultants to work on the project. And it wasn't to create a safety net for us. It was really to build a team, and we had our skills. And one of the first two really were the envelope and the structure, the two big components. And we came and we interviewed a lot of people, and you know, made our selection. So in a way, our office, though small at the time, it was five-person team, which basically my office was about 12 at the time. So lion's share of people. We simply joined a group of people who were also front. It was only 7 people when we started the project. I think we grew, I don't know, to 40 or something like that over the next few years. So I think it was a kind of collective sense that we were going to work on a project that was important if we could just somehow get it through. And I think finally the commissions that we had and got in our office at that time, none of them were ever about expediency, or no one would hire us to do that. So the curious thing was Alf presented this project as a cultural opportunity. And we were obviously less concerned, you know, about it as a project to a certain extent the way he was on a real estate level. But our concerns and his concerns just were parts of the componentry of the team. So I think we couldn't have done it without the constellation of everyone, for sure. And that gave us confidence. But it did, you know, we were so excited every day to come into the office and work on it and go, we're going to build it. We're just going to do it. It's going to happen. Alf's going to keep going. And that's what happened.
Did you ever think you weren't going to keep going?
I did, actually.
Well, when Lehman fell. Well,
twice, actually. You know, we talked about the price, but we first consulted with Bovis about, they were our CM for the pre-con. And when we got the original dollars and cents, it was just, I mean, through the roof. We saved a lot of money just by doing a mixed project, which is we did the steel and the curtain wall erection union, but all of the finish work was done non-union. And that actually allowed to get us, I think, better quality, you know, flooring installers, electrical, slab installers. I mean, all of that was bought at a much cheaper rate.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say the only thing we didn't get production on was carpentry, because in hiring a non-union carpentry firm, couldn't flood the building with carpenters. So I would say that stalled us a little bit.
The other thing was, and I can't blame them, but they were pricing on fear factor.
Sure.
The unknown.
And you used BIM, you said?
We used, well, yeah, we did. We sort of made a process that operated like them, but it wasn't Revit. But yeah,
so it didn't go out. It didn't go 3D to the subs.
It did go 3D
it did.
to the subs. We also produced traditional drawings out of it, but everything in terms of the envelope and the set outs of the center lines of the steel and everything, it was all 3D. But they were, you know, looking at the building and going, you know, it's not a box. Let's just find a multiplier for everything. And if they couldn't find a sub, they were just, you know, putting numbers on it. And again, you couldn't really blame them. But I think all of us did not want to waver from the project in any way. And so it was basically a kind of holy grail project to find people who could, you know, build the project for the level of specification without, you know.
So can we talk, I'm just really curious to talk about numbers, at least until we make you mildly uncomfortable. So, you know, so you bought the land, it sounds like at about $150 an FAR foot, something like that?
Yes, and if we hadn't have bought the land very cheaply, this kind of a project could not have been done.
So you got a great land price.
Right.
And then you're in at hard costs of $850 to $900 a foot. So if I'm doing my math anywhere right, you're break even somewhere around $1,200, $1,300, something like that?
Soft costs were a little bit more, but our break even was a little bit higher than that.
Okay, so, you know, and so you started sales.
Well, we actually, it's interesting, we started sales, we pre-sold 3 or 4 units.
Right.
We then we ran into our neighbor issue, who really, the reason for him asking to for us to not build was that he had a penthouse that he hadn't sold, and it ran 70 feet along the perimeter of our site. And basically, once our project went up, that building was going to be bathed, that unit was going to be bathed in darkness. So, and he was losing a site downtown, so he had every, you know, kind of incentive in the world to kind of see if there was some accommodation we could give him, which of course we didn't. But that took some time. So we had a few buyers. Those buyers were either foreigners who then saw the dollar work against them, or they were people that actually, in one case, one person moved to LA and the other person lost his job. But then in the second go around of buyers that walked into the marketplace were really our target in the first place. The first buyers were really not.
And when was that? When was that second go around of buyers?
The second go around was really 2011. Okay, and so you know,
so there was a long inhale in there.
Yeah, but we basically held off
right.
from really marketing the site, because it all became about, you've got to give people, the lobby's got to be finished, the elevator's got to be finished, They've got to walk into the units. You have to have furnished models.
Right.
We went through a very strong procedure. We only ran one ad in the period of time we did it. And now from the time that we originally signed those initial contracts, we raised the prices, some of them $1 million a unit, some of them $500,000 a unit. So there was never a confidence about selling the units, because basically the living rooms were almost 1,000 square feet. When you took the third bedroom out, we had done a lot of shoring, and when you can build in steel, you can really get a lot more efficiency in terms of the spacing of columns. So unlike concrete, where you've got a column every 18 feet. So we had these wonderful, really open spaces that really no one else could provide. And when people walked into the units and they saw, you really feel like you're hanging dead over the high line. We just knew we had to get them finished, and literally every crevice had to be manicured, and so that we would get the kind of buyers, and we've gotten a lot of great, some foreign buyers, kind of a really beautiful mix, a lot of people in the media, no Wall Street people whatsoever.
Sorry, business school students.
They probably they want more traditional, is what I would guess. They want what Zeckendorf is going to offer
Right.
at $6,000 a square foot.
You know, I mean, and people that were really very...
That's right.
No, but Zeckendorf did look at a project in this neighborhood,
Right.
and they then, you know, the market changed. And really design was the issue. So our first buyer was hands down male, 100% male, bought the total car aesthetic, kind of a little rough around the edges. The second buyer was really this several empty nesters, some people from Europe, very cultured, second, third, fourth residences. Exactly what we expected the first time. 50%, the first person to move into the building was a woman, an advertising executive. So we were very surprised. The second time around, it was really a much more mixed group of people.
But what you're really saying is, you clearly had this incredible faith in the architecture, right? That you looked at, I mean, if you had a break even of $1,500 a foot and you were looking around, and the comps probably weren't much higher than that on most condos in the area, and yet you just sort of felt that it was the faith in the architecture that ultimately that was going to pull you through, because you knew you had a product that no one else could match.
Well, we also had, I saw the market start to teeter, because I'd looked at a very big project to finance, and the banks told me this was a huge site, no money for this kind of a project. I started to see that what was going to happen into the landscape. So I said, I really would like to continue building during this period. What does this building have as an attribute? And what it had as an attribute was it would be one of the few kind of high design projects that would be for sale in the marketplace. We would be building kind of during the downturn, and I knew what we came out of the downturn, as long as we completed the project as kind of planned, there wouldn't be other projects of this nature coming onto the market, so I thought we'd have a captive audience. So that was really my faith, is that the whole supply of units really dropped out of the market. And there's always a buyer that says, I want something new, unlived in, clean, fresh design, show me what's out there. And there's really, there hasn't been anything new coming through the pipeline. So I knew that's what would really kind of give us an edge over the market.
Yeah, should we go to the audience and take a few questions?
I'm just wondering how much the High Line figured into that for buyers.
I'd say that the people that came to the site were very much enamored with, I think the High Line gave us, the second phase of the High Line was really just about as we were finishing the building. So, a bird's eye view of the High Line, I've never seen it. So it really was a huge advantage, and that's why we never ran any advertising, because we always had this tie-in.
Do you find that the architecture, as art in this case, gave you some kind of flexibility with the zoning and planning officials in terms of the easements you got?
Say that again?
Did the man like it?
Did we have did zoning
you get your approvals because of the architecture?
Oh, I think the architecture played a substantial role in getting the design built. I think city planning is very keen about good architecture. But also we have other sites in the neighborhood, and we wanted to set the bar high. I mean, this was kind of a test project, let's say. There's no economy and scale in this project. So, but we felt if we did a project of this nature, it would encourage other developers to bring their A game to this site and keep out kind of the type of sites that get built in a lot of neighborhoods in Manhattan. And I think it's really proven the case is that everybody feels challenged that what's been built in this neighborhood is good and they've got to step up to the plate.
I want to amplify that and the answer, and it's a, you know, in terms of rules and regulations, aesthetics, there's no check mark for aesthetics in city planning. No one can comment and say that's a beautiful building, we should do it. Formally, it cannot be done. That's what we understood. Now, Alf had to have some sense of optimism, we all did, for the project. So we made the design of the project and we submitted it to Amanda. And she wrote a letter that said, we will, you know, the building is great and we will, you know, support this project. You're going to go through all the hoops, all the hurdles. There's no back end, there's no winking of anything. It's just sort of like, we think that the architecture is demanding, it's valuable, but it's up to you to, you know, do the due diligence. So we submitted 5 or 6 times issues of light and air, obviously issues of incursion of space, et cetera, et cetera. So the building magically somehow, you know, became a thing which on paper could pass, but of course Amanda and the whole board were very clear in saying one-time only exceptions. This will not become a new paradigm, as you know. Well, maybe until the next.
Well, so it's an interesting policy question.
Yeah.
And you can come down on a couple of different sides of it, but I do think what you're saying is absolutely correct in the sense that it's not a beauty contest issue. And so clearly, I mean, the diagrams that Neil showed us, clearly you have to make an argument, you know, that you're achieving the goals of city planning. You're getting light and air down to the High Line, to the street and so forth. You're just achieving those parameters in some different way. And so, you know, it's not this thing that you draw a pretty picture and somehow they wave their magic wand. And I think that's an excellent point to make.
Yeah.
So the gentleman in the back.
Yes. What is the rationale and economics of having floors 2 and 3 as a single duplex with large terrace rather than 2 separate condos?
2 and 3 are both below the High Line. So we just decided that, and rather than have 2 mediocre units, we would have 1 better unit. What we did is we double heighted where the terrace is, so it gave it a sense of scale. When you're underneath the High Line, you don't really get this great sense of you know, openness. So it was really just about creating more of a family apartment, a little small townhouse at the base. And it's one of the units that actually has not sold. And it's actually the deal if you'd like to buy it. So. And just to make a comment about the site, it was zoned under the 99 zoning. So it was one of the few sites that didn't receive any kind of, let's say, benefits from the 2005 West Chelsea rezoning. So when this West Chelsea rezoning went through, it really put the nail in the coffin from this site ever being built at 85,000, built as a total of 85,000 square feet. The land is actually the same size as the Nouvelle site. So this one site was really severely impacted by the rezoning, and that's why there was some sensitivity. You know, we could have possibly gone for a BSA case, and maybe we would have gotten a taller building, but it was a very good, which BSA means Board of Standards and Appeals, but we could have gone, you know, that route as well. I think time-wise it probably would have been the same. Yeah, I agree.
What was your average price per square foot that you got?
$2,000.
Does the building contribute financially to the maintenance of the High Line, either formally or informally?
No, the developer contributes to the maintenance of the High Line. In fact, all of the developers were very supportive of there was actually a PID called PID, a Public Improvement District, that was proposed. And it was soon after withdrawn because there was some neighborhood or kind of local owner opposition to supporting some type of a park like this that many felt were really about the tourists coming. I mean, I think the High Line must be in every guidebook in the world today, because if you go up there and you take a walk along the High Line, I think you'll hear 15 or 20 languages during the course of your walk. So it does depend on, private individuals and developers contributing money. But there is no kind of set requirement for buildings to contribute.
It's a longer discussion than we probably have time for. That was considered at one point when the rezoning was passed, but and I know it's hard to imagine this in retrospect, because a lot of people think that a lot of this development actually helps to pay for the High Line, which it doesn't. But it was contemplated, but at the time there were real questions about how successful any of this was going to be. I mean, back then there were questions about whether the High Line was even going to be safe, and it was a real leap of faith. And there were, it took, visionaries like ALF, and there were a number of other visionary development entities, I think, that went in there and took a lot of risk associated with what the High Line ultimately could be, because they had faith in it. But it wasn't clear that the rezoning itself was going to generate that kind of money for the High Line. One last question.
$15 million from the bank. You got $15 million from the bank instead of $31 million. How did you make up the difference?
We actually had just a small interim loan to start with, and that was less than $5 million. And we actually we were going to retire that loan and put a $30 million loan on the property. At the end of the day, we rejected the $15 million loan. And I had a partner who really believed in the architecture and the design and the project itself. And along with some air rights that we sold and equity that I put into the project, we just ended up funding it privately. There wasn't, because by the time that we paid off our loan and took this $15 million, it just wasn't worth having the bank, as our partner. So it actually was financed privately. One of the nice things about when you do a small project, you have a sense of control. If something does get a little more expensive or whatever, you have a way to control it, because it isn't 80 units. It's just, 14 stories.
Okay. Linda, closing? Oh.
I thought that was your
Yeah.
Obviously, the building is very, technology, the way you guys process. Was this something, Alf, you said this was the first building you actually controlled as far as construction. Is this something of kind of a forced marriage, or something you were interested in getting into? And is this something you'd use in your future projects?
Well, I'm looking forward to the next few projects where I'm kind of sitting in the catbird seat, and all of the various moves that should be made, and all the tricks kind of to shortcuts and timing issues that really do arise. So I'm not looking to run the next project that I do, more just looking to have had the experience to go through it firsthand and walk out with the battle scars. We did make this a green project, by the way, for anybody that's interested. We handed out a book to a few of you people that we had some excess monographs on the project. I'm sorry everybody didn't get one, but we did. It's in there about the green design, and it wasn't a marketing part of the building, because really, interestingly enough, buyers are not ever going to be motivated about green design. They may think it's a nice feature, but it's nothing that's going to drive them to buy a unit.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I want to thank our guests, Alf Naiman and Neil Denari. It was great. Thank you to my colleague, Lindsay Galen. This is a great story of risk and reward. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks. Good night.
Thank you.
When did you move here from Philly?
Sorry.
When did you move here from Philly?
No, actually Boston.
Really?
Yeah.
Such a Philly accent. Yeah.
Sound like Philly. I've heard that before.